Alright, so the next big devlog dropped from YouTuber Big Fry regarding his upcoming game Transience, and with it, the team also released a free demo on Steam. I'll have links to the devlog itself, the Steam page, and Big Fry's YouTube channel in the description if you're interested in checking those out. But to summarize for those unfamiliar, Big Fry is an FPS focused channel that has garnered a lot of notoriety over the years for his very direct criticism of the games in the FPS genre, especially indie titles that try to exploit Steam's early access program. So he's gathered a team to create his own game, a tactical FPS that is single player only, and a lot of eyes are on Big Fry to put his money where his mouth is with his own indie title. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the devlog itself. I'd rather focus this video on feedback of the demo, but I'll say that I continue to find the general art direction of this game incredibly impressive, especially what he showed off in that devlog. And when you include the samples of the soundtrack from the video, it just radiates film noir combined with shades of a slightly cyberpunk influenced near future. It's a really unique aesthetic and style that they're going for, and I think they're really nailing it so far. There's a ton more to see in the devlog. I highly recommend checking it out if you're even slightly interested in this game, and if you aren't interested in the game, it's kind of cool to watch just to understand how project development works in general, and I just have to applaud the dev team for their dedication so far. So now let's move on to the meat and potatoes, the free demo of Transience. For some context, within the demo there are a few guns on offer in the initial room, then there's a firing range, and finally a kill house with AI enemies to really get a feel of the gameplay. I want to start out with the positives because I think when Transience is doing something well, it's doing it really well. The weapon animation quality so far is extremely impressive. It's better than most AAA games on the market, being bested perhaps only by the likes of the Modern Warfare games, but even then it's not by much. It doesn't always come across so well in YouTube videos, but seeing these animations in person was a pleasure. And again, I have to applaud the attention to detail and overall quality coming from such a small group of people. I also like the on-the-fly weapon customization. It reminds me a lot of what we saw in World War III and is generally a system I've grown attached to with World War III and Battlefield 2042. To continue with weapons, I love that each one felt like it had a distinct identity. Obviously things like stats and use cases can be a little difficult to fully judge right now since we are just limited to that firing range and kill house, but I was happy to see that guns don't just feel like slight deviations of one another just with different models. This is something I've gotten really frustrated with in games like Call of Duty, where half the weapons in any category are nearly identical to one another when it comes to in-game performance and characteristics. From here, all of the immersion aspects were pretty much on point for being so early in the process. Lighting, mood, voice acting, art style, and weapon audio all far exceeded my expectations going in, and once the whole story is rolled out, I can see myself really enjoying the narrative and world building. Even the little details like a plasticky sound effect after throwing a used med pen on the ground were touches I really enjoyed, especially since I could leave the room and come back and still see my discarded med pens on the ground. Details like that are what really elevate the immersion in Transience to a completely different level, and I'm happy to see it here. I also just love to finally see an FPS putting a single player narrative front and center. I feel like Titanfall 2 all the way from 2016 was the last really good single player experience I had with an FPS, with others since then often feeling like afterthoughts or just omitting single player entirely. Performance also felt shockingly rock solid in the demo. While the graphics are obviously not on the level of something like Cyberpunk 2077, it's definitely a pretty good looking game, at least to me, and we've seen far worse looking games with not only lower average frame rates, but also a lot more large dips and stutters. In my time with the demo, I didn't crash once or encounter any strange graphical glitches, and the frame rates felt very stable, though I am on a relatively high-end system. From here I wanted to get into a few small nitpicks. There are some things that I'm sure the team is aware of and are honestly not all that important when pushing a demo out that's more focused on gameplay characteristics, but I thought I'd mention these quickly anyway. Font scaling is really rough, and I did not see an option to change the font size. On my 1440p monitor, the text was often too small to comfortably read from 8 to 12 inches away. Some keys didn't have images for rebinding in the menus. I found this specifically with the thumb mouse buttons, which I often use for things like crouch toggle. I'm not personally very fond of the decision to show available ammo in a mag as individual bullets instead of just a number. To me, it clutters the UI, and I don't think it adds much additional challenge to checking ammo. In my opinion, if the design decision is to add an extra layer of complexity, it might be better to remove ammo count entirely from the UI and have a button to check the mag, kind of like Tarkov does, but I think numbers would suit this game just fine. It would also just declutter the UI so the player can focus a little more on environmental immersion and planning their approach to different situations. I find the blur effect when you're low on health to be a little too extreme. I also find the recoil to be a touch excessive. I'm I'm sure it's meant to promote tap firing, but it feels a little jarring compared to other tactical FPS games on the market I've played. I'm also not in love with no auto reload on an empty mag, but I understand this is probably a design decision to keep the player aware of the moment and occasionally create these oh shit moments when you realize you've emptied the mag and need to run for safety. There's also occasional strange alignment and visibility with optics where the iron sights end up blocking a lot of visibility. Or in the case of that square-shaped red dot sight, I just find the frame of that sight to be a little too small and more annoying than I'd like a red dot to be. Again, those are all really small nitpicks though. They don't really ruin my enjoyment of the game, and I did enjoy it quite a bit. But now I want to mention a few bigger criticisms I have and finish off with what might be a potential deal breaker for me. There is a delay before being able to fire a gun after a reload animation is finished. From my brief observation, I think it might be some kind of issue when I'm perceiving the animation is done and the bullets are actually showing as available in the UI. Either way, I'd like this to be tightened up a bit more, and there's a similar issue where there's a delay in swapping to another weapon after a reload. I assume these are related issues. I'm thinking there's some kind of block on actions until the bullets are showing as available again, which might be when the animation is actually finished, though to me it ends up feeling more like a delay. I'm not quite sure where the issue lies specifically, but to me it's something that really breaks the heated moments and makes them feel a little more annoying.
Fuck! This was your last fucking mistake! Reload!
If it is an intentional decision, I'm sure part of it is meant to reduce reload spam when you've only fired 1 or 2 rounds, but I'd still like it to be tightened up. Finally, with reloads, I generally find them a touch too slow. Again, this might be just to avoid reload spam after just a few rounds, but especially when it's combined with those delays I mentioned, it feels really sluggish. I'd like for them to be sped up, but not by much. I understand they're not going for arcade here. They don't want these super fast sleight of hand style reloads, but I think a slight bump could really help with the general fluidity of engagements. This next one is something that might just be me, but I found the weapon shake when firing full auto to be excessive. I know that to a degree this comes down to my personal sensitivity to this kind of thing, but I found myself having a slight headache after about half an hour. I'd love to have an option to turn the general shakiness down, maybe as an accessibility setting. I don't want to mess too much with the artistic vision for the game, but I'd also like to avoid headaches. Again though, this might just be something more specific to me and you might not experience something like this. AI in the kill house would often cluster together, allowing me to mow down multiple opponents far more easily than I'd like. This could be partially due to the very tight quarters of the kill house, even within the individual rooms, but I was surprised to see multiple instances of 2 or 3 enemies conveniently lining up for a mag dump. And finally, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the thing that might be the deal breaker for me, and that often made me feel really frustrated when playing the demo. The movement in Transience is rough, like really rough. Let me be clear, I'm not saying I want some super arcadey movement shooter mechanics we see in other games brought here. In fact, outside of Titanfall, I actually don't really like the whole advanced movement trend. For me, my issues with the movement came down to a few key things that I think could pretty easily be addressed. First and foremost, the default standing move speed is painfully, dreadfully slow. I understand it's there for the purposes of proceeding cautiously, peeking corners and room clearing, and it works really well for that. But just make this something the player can toggle and have a normal trot or jog speed that would be the default. From there, I'd also make the full sprint speed a hair faster, not by much, but just enough to create enough distinction between the jog and the sprint. I was sure that this really slow walk speed was just forced onto the player when going through the office area, maybe to encourage a little bit of looking around before entering the kill house. But when I opened that door and entered the fray, my heart sank when my character moved like he was taking a morning stroll in the park, and that my only 2 options were a full-blown sprint and just this walk. When it comes to sprinting, there's this odd ramp-up period before the character actually sprints. I'm guessing this is intentional and meant to simulate acceleration, but it ends up feeling more like a delay before he just does what I told him to do. It almost feels like he needs to go Super Saiyan for a second before running. I don't necessarily mind there being a ramp-up period. It's really hard to judge in this small, confined demo, but it does just feel a bit off, and that's never something you want the player to feel. And to top it off, there is a really strange floatiness or momentum when trying to stop from a sprint. I assume this is meant to kind of simulate momentum, but it ends up almost feeling like the low gravity movement in a game like Starfield rather than being a character's momentum stopping. Regardless of whether or not this is intended, I think it's something that needs to go entirely. It doesn't feel especially realistic to have something like this. As a guy that played high school basketball, I could easily stop on a dime from a full sprint. No extra steps to slow down first, no issues with balance, I could just stop immediately. I find it really hard to believe that an athletic, highly trained operative wouldn't be able to do the same. So I know that altogether, it kind of sounds like I'm dunking on the gameplay of Transience, and I want to be clear. The gameplay on the whole actually feels really good. And after spending some time with the demo, I'm really optimistic about what the full release will look like. The entire feeling of playing a game doesn't really work through a video, so if you haven't checked out the demo for yourself, I highly recommend that you do. Generally speaking, I had a great time with it, and I think most people who are into tactical FPS games will too. And that wraps up my thoughts on Transience so far, and I want to hear from all of you. From those who have tried the demo, what do you think? And if you haven't tried it yet, do you plan to? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to talk about it. With that, thank you for watching, leave a like or a dislike, and I'll see you in the next video.
What the? There's nothing here. Stop for a second. I heard something. What the hell was that? What? They got one of our guys! Friendly down!